In this video, I'm going to talk about the pitfalls of using Find a Grave. Don't want to watch the whole thing? Well, here's the quick version. Only rely on information you can see on a picture of the gravestone. Why? A gravestone is a primary source document. Shortly after or before the deceased passed away, someone who knew them, probably a close family member, ordered that tombstone. Everything else in a Find a Grave record that isn't on the tombstone came from another source that's unknown to you, and it's potentially unreliable. I'm Mike O'Neill, and a big data professional and amateur genealogist who has made tons of mistakes since I picked up genealogy as a hobby in 2011. I want to help you avoid some of my mistakes. Find a Grave is probably the largest crowdsourced genealogy tool out there. Now, what do I mean by crowdsourced? It means that a huge bunch of people contributed to its creation, in this case, completely as volunteers. This is in contrast to a site such as Ancestry.com, which pays people to transcribe data from a collection like a census record. At its root, Find a Grave collects transcriptions from gravestones, or in some cases a grave register, and even the most basic record on Find a Grave should give you 3 key pieces of information. First, the name. Second, the year of death, or in some cases just burial, and the place of the burial. Now, depending on the gravestone and how much information the volunteer transcribed from the gravestone, you may get birth dates too, and occasionally you'll even get a place of birth and or a relationship, such as wife or son, to a person buried close by. The catch is that Find a Grave doesn't distinguish between information transcribed on a tombstone and information that a user has added from other sources. Let me give you an example. James Fitzgerald, who is buried in St. Mary's Cemetery in Maple Park, Illinois. His gravestone notes that he was born in 1867 and died in 1929, but that's all it says. Find a Grave, however, gives exact dates, places of birth and death, and links to his parents and wife. Information which you can see isn't on his gravestone and probably wouldn't even be recorded in the cemetery's files. So how do you know that that information is accurate? Well, you don't, unless you can find other documents related to James. When I look at a Find a Grave record, I make 2 assumptions. First, the person who created it has good intentions, so they're not fabricating facts out of thin air. Second, despite their best efforts, they're human, and they're going to make mistakes, both honest and careless. Someone must have known enough about James Fitzgerald to fill in all these details. So when I add James to my tree, I enter the information from his tombstone as facts, and the rest of the information is notes to help me accelerate my search. Again, assume good intent. Somebody had some reason to put in those specific dates and places. Knowing what they are is going to help you find documents that list those dates and places a lot faster. Now, this may seem overly cautious, but let me show you an example where this really matters. Consider the Find a Grave entry for Elizabeth Ironmonger, who died in 1675. There's a lot of detail in the record, but I was immediately suspicious, not only because there's no picture of a gravestone, but I know from experience that the custom in colonial Virginia was to inter family members in a plot on the family land. Don't believe me? Take a primary source document. Hugh Jones's 1724 book, The Present State of Virginia, which notes that, and I quote, "The parishes being of great extent, some 60 miles long and upwards, many dead corpses cannot be conveyed to the church to be buried, so that it is customary to bury in gardens or orchards, where whole families lie interred together." But let's put custom aside. Maybe Elizabeth was an exception to custom. Then I have to ask whether the church was even in existence in 1675 for Elizabeth to be buried there. The church's website suggests that the parish was founded around 1652, but that the current structure, which dates to sometime between 1690 and 1718 or 19, wasn't in the same location as the church Elizabeth would have attended in life. All that's left of that original structure is the remains of a brick foundation and a single gravestone. On top of that, according to the website's notes about the church's cemetery, the first known burial at the present church was in 1723, nearly 5 decades after Elizabeth died, and several years after the current church was completed. Now, some family cemeteries were later moved and reinterred on church grounds, but the earliest such reinterment was for a man who died in the 1690s. So it's possible that Elizabeth Ironmonger was buried at the Ware Church, but the odds are exceptionally long. So, assuming good intent, I'll assume that whoever created this record was just trying to make an educated guess. Maybe they have some evidence she attended that church and assume she was buried there. But if they were willing to make this educated guess, how many other guesses are here? Were they guessing about her place and year of birth? Did they find two people with the name Ironmonger and just assume that they were her spouse and child? Who knows, but I'm not going to rely on that record. Of course, sometimes you can't rely on the tombstone. Putting aside the fact that the tombstone engraver could have made a mistake, let's take a look at Jacob Slow, who's buried in Norristown, Pennsylvania. Find a Grave has two tombstones. One is faded and barely readable, though I was able to find a DAR report of the inscription which supports the birth and death dates of the Find a Grave record. The other tombstone, which has the inscription Private 8th Class 2nd Battalion, Northampton County Militia, looks brand new. It doesn't even have grass growing around its edges. The abbreviations and the way of referring to military units also feels pretty modern. My experience with records at the time, they don't list things out with those abbreviations and with that level of detail. I think that second gravestone was added by living relatives to honor Jacob's military service in the Revolution. Here's the kicker, though. That Jacob Slow didn't serve in the Revolution. Norristown is about 60 miles from Northampton County, where another Jacob Slow appears in contemporary military, land, tax, and church records. Now, I know 60 miles doesn't sound far, but don't forget, it took George Washington's troops most of the night to trudge 13 miles from Trenton to Princeton in January of 1777.